Recently, one of my favorite viewers named Mandy made some really interesting correlations between one of my previous videos on racism and the situation we're dealing with immigrants from other countries right now, namely Syria and other Middle Eastern countries. Now, first, it needs to be understood that all Middle Eastern countries are not exactly the same. You're going to deal with a much more literal definition of Sharia law, for instance, when you're dealing with people from Iraq, or I'm sorry, from Iran, or from Saudi Arabia, all the way down to Jordan, which is very, very Western. And so they're not all going to be the same, but the point she was trying to make is that when dealing with immigrants that come over to our country, being understanding and leading by example instead of just trying to force them into your way of thinking is the way you have to do it. And a lot of people wind up trying to take these hardline approaches to people of other cultures when they feel that those cultures somehow represent something they're against. Now, this kind of reminds me of a conversation I had with a good friend of mine many years ago where we were talking about the Iraqi War, and he was basically saying that the way they treated women in certain Muslim countries was wrong, and that we shouldn't treat them, and that we should go over and change that, basically. And I said, well, in my opinion, that isn't fair. Not all cultures are going to progress and evolve at the same time. Try to imagine for a moment that, I don't know, the Tibetans suddenly had a lot more people and a lot more money and became military oriented for some random reason, and decided to come over and try to take over America because we didn't treat animals well. Well, we probably wouldn't take to that very well now, would we? And it's very much the same way with these other cultures. Now, keep in mind, if you've seen my video on Sharia law, that what we call Sharia law is actually very similar to ancient biblical law. And what you're really seeing isn't necessarily an extreme form of dealing with people, of cultural law. What you're dealing with is an older version. If we were to take a lot of the things in the Bible literally, we would be stoning people too. And while those things are obviously reprehensible in our culture, we do have to be understanding of people that come over to ours and have differing views. Now, that does not mean that we have to allow people to be stoned in our country. Obviously, that, you know, when you come over to another society, you do have to follow those societies' laws, and sometimes that can be difficult, and sometimes that can be harsh. And obviously, I'm not speaking here of some of the unfortunate incidents where immigrants have wound up raping people or doing various bad things to people, which obviously step outside any sort of law. But I am merely talking about cultural clashes and what I tend to refer to as growing pains. Anytime that we have another culture coming into our culture, coming into other European cultures, because a lot of European countries are taking a lot of those refugees, obviously they're going to see things differently. But when you approach them, approaching them as you're doing something wrong, and we hate you for it, and you need to do what we do, and you need to do it the way we do it. A very simple example of that would be the burqas that some women wear. Keep in mind that both burqas and hijabs are not worn by everyone in Islam. It's a great misunderstanding that's true. Some people wear it, some people don't. In Jordan, for instance, women wear it if they want to be very devout Muslims. They don't wear it if they don't want to. And it's really only in Saudi Arabia and Iran where it's required. And the burqa is if I remember all this correctly, the burqa covers the entire face. A hijab is just mostly covers the hair. And this is a cultural thing. And it's not unlike a lot of Christians in the old days. The idea of head covering is actually in the Jewish society as well, and nuns, for instance, cover their head in a very similar way, and it would be absurd for you to expect Catholics not to do that in your country. But we do have to be understanding, and I think that's the simplest way of putting this. Leading by example, showing another culture that you're good people, that you're nice, that you're loving, that you're kind, instead of coming across with your fist in the air. That is the only way you're going to affect positive change. And obviously, like anyone else in my society, I don't like some things that I see, particularly the way women are treated. Some of those cultural problems that I even have a problem with some Christians, you know, some of the more traditional Christians and conservatives in general that still insist on these gender roles, which I personally consider somewhat absurd, but those cultures don't necessarily. And again, coming across with your fist in the air is not, in my opinion, the way to handle it. So this is a very important concept in general, the way that we treat other cultures, the way that we treat other people. And Mandy, I think that was a really good observation, tying that in with my racism video. So just something for all you guys to think about. I'm the Urban Omnist. I'll see you guys on the next one. During my last episode of Race... That's not true. It's not during. It's after. After the last episode I did on racism, one of my favorite viewers named Mandy mentioned something rather significant. She compared what I was saying about racism to, shall we say, cultural growing pains that occur whenever you have a large influx of migrants, which sounds ridiculously clinical, and I can't believe I actually put it that way. So I think I'm going to completely redo this. Thank you very much. After the last video I did on racism, one of my favorite viewers named Mandy made some really interesting comments comparing what I was saying about racism to what, shall we say, occurs when you have a large bunch of migrants. In the last video I did on cultural racism, racism of culture, culture of the racism of the culture, which cultured on its own racism, thereby resulting in an infrequent biflex of the coflexant adjunct cosmology, which always is the result of over-exemplifying an existential universe, thereby by anti-disestablishmentarianizing the hell am I talking about? Racism. That's the last thing I talked about, and it's not what I'm going to talk about this time, because there's other stuff to be talked about, like mayonnaise. I'm just going to leave that one right there.